So frank, generous, and amiable was he, that he had not an enemy in the kingdom. And yet this man of unparalleled fortune died in the prime of life, utterly ruined in fame and estate, not as a gentleman and a soldier dies, but the vile death of a ruffianly thief, and so universally loathed that all France hailed his execution with a sigh of relief. Retiring early from active service, he fitted up his castle like a palace in a fairy tale, took troops of musicians, players, and dancing girls into his service, and made his life thenceforth for many years a gorgeous pageant, keeping an open house for all comers, and offering such attractions. It was not wonderful that his visitors should count by thousands, and a motley herd they were, counts, courtesans, and conjurers, bishops and bravos, rhymers, roisterers, and reprobates of all sorts, elbowing each other at all times within his walls. Indeed, the court of Marshal de Retz completely eclipsed that of his suzerain, the Duke of Brittany. But depravity crept in, spread, flourished, and at length became so thoroughly master of the revels that all who had any sense of morality left in them shunned the scene. The flight of respectability, however, was regarded as a positive relief by the mob that remained. Thenceforward they indulged without restraint, anticipating all that has been recorded of the Palais Royal or the Folie des Jarretières. But corrupt as were the guests, they were infinitely surpassed in evil by their host. He liked indeed to contemplate and encourage, but he disdained to share their common vices. When he indulged, it was in secret, for to such extremity of excess had he attained, that he was compelled to shroud it away down in the darkest vaults of his castle from even the vicious eyes of that crew. We cannot enter into the details of this man's fall. We can pause to tell how impostors, knaves of mystic pretence, wormed into his confidence, and led him step by step to every sort of ruin. Nor dare we describe the orgies that were enacted daily in those horrid cells. It is enough to say that the victims of licentiousness, little children most of them, or very young girls, were afterwards immolated to Satan, and that the choicest delight of this awful voluptuary consisted in dealing the fatal stab and watching its dreadful consequences. At length so many females had disappeared unaccountably from the neighbourhood of the Barbe Bleue, and so many continued to vanish daily, that the attention of the authorities was roused, and the sensation must have been great indeed to have effected such a marvel in favour of unshod rivals. From the very beginning, suspicion pointed with an undeviating finger at de Retz, not, however, on account of his embarrassments, his character, or the character of his confidants, most of them notorious alchemists and conjurers, nor even because of the missing number. For he had had authority taken into its head to lay hands on every high-born profligate who consorted with such vermin, and who lived in a neighbourhood where lowly women were given to vanish mysteriously, very few nobles indeed would have been left at large in France or anywhere else. Nor was there any positive evidence adduced against the Maréchal prior to his captivity. But people generally felt, as they always feel in such cases, through a species of unaccountable but unerring instinct, that de Retz and no other was the guilty man. He was seized with his confederate and tutor in diablerie, one prelate, and his castle searched. Heaps of bones, human skins covered with magical inscriptions, and all the sorcerer's hideous stock in trade were brought from the vaults. And in the ensuing trial threw a fearful light on these things. It was fairly proved that considerably more than 100 lives had been sacrificed by the Maréchal and his instructor within 2 years, and there were reasonable grounds for surmising that these were but a moiety of the victims. And yet this precious pair, the monstrous fool and the mystic knave, embraced tenderly on the scaffold, and comforted one another with the confident trust of meeting immediately in paradise. Lycanthropy was the strangest form of that faith. It was less original, however, than some of the other phases, for the same thing, or something very like it, was current among the ancients, but the strength it put forth and the variety it assumed in different quarters during the Middle Ages showed that it was no slavish imitation of the classic fable. The loup-garou of France and Western Germany was indeed very different from the man-wolf of Ireland, and neither of these bore much resemblance, except in general features, to the werewolf of Livonia. The last-named country was the favourite haunt of these terrible creatures. But so it was also of every species of witchcraft. Indeed, the spirits of darkness made themselves so much at home in that province that it was a common thing for a family woman to maintain an imp as a domestic servant. Then about a second week in December, the demon went up and down in the shape of a lame boy to summon the fraternity to a general rendezvous. Accordingly, they gathered by thousands, including every rank, and if any lagged behind under any pretence, they were quickly flogged into their place by a demon armed with a whip made of neatly twisted wire, whose special duty it was to look after stragglers. Beginning on Christmas Eve, they amused themselves for 12 or 14 days with worrying flocks, herds, and villages, and especially with breaking their way into cellars and gulping whatever was drinkable therein. In this quarter, that is the east of the Elbe, those who were desirous of fighting as werewolves obtained the power by coughing a nauseous draught from the hands of one already initiated, and for a long time it seems to have been regarded as a pleasant and frolicsome, and even at times a useful sort of relaxation. We are informed that on one occasion a party, while crossing a Russian waste, having fallen short of provisions, the servant of a nobleman present very quickly removed the embarrassment by assuming the form of a wolf and catching several sheep, and another gentleman transformed himself in order to remove the doubts which a friend entertained concerning the existence of such a power. But being assailed by some dogs, he lost an eye before he could resume his proper shape. A thief, too, who was sentenced to be gibbeted, walked quietly out of his cell in the form of a wolf the moment they opened the door to lead him to the scaffold, and escaped the woods before the astonished gaolers could make any effort to stop him. In Western Europe, the loup-garou was by no means so gregarious. There are several instances, indeed, related of small bands of wolves without tails, that is to say, werewolves, assailing the flocks. But generally speaking, the French and German monsters were solitary in their habits, or at the very most hunted only in couples. And there was besides a sad want of uniformity in their method of assuming the beast. One of them, who fed the flames in the south of France, declared that a demon met him in the fields, persuaded him to join the fraternity, and presented him with a box of inexhaustible ointment. With this unguent he smeared himself whenever he felt the beastly propensity strong upon him, and he recovered the semblance of humanity by plunging into water or rolling over and over in the dew. Another, who was burnt for the crime at Cologne, confessed that a female devil had presented him with a belt, and that whenever he buckled it, he immediately became a wolf. This individual declared, with amiable simplicity, that he never could make out what became of the bristles that ornamented him when he was in his wolfish state. He expressed a small compunction, however, for the murder of the 16 children whom he had destroyed during his career, and not at all for the minor peccadilloes of marrying his mother-in-law and his own daughter. Others again asserted that they had each received a wolf's hide from the demon, which being donned like an overcoat was just as effective as the diabolical salve. In confirmation of this last explanation, a traveller of the period tells us that, while journeying through the south of France in the train of a nobleman, the company overtook an elderly peasant who seemed much distressed with the weight of his bundle. As they were going the same way, the leader of the party desired one of his valets to relieve the old man of his burden for the rest of the stage. On arriving at the end of the day's journey, the valet, a prying knave, opened the wallet, and finding a neat wolf-skin within, resolved to amuse his master with a little masquerade. Accordingly, he pulled on the hide, but the moment he saw the company, he felt himself actuated with all the ferocity of the animal he represented. The gentlemen drew their swords in self-defence, and inflicted several wounds on their assailant before he could extricate himself from his mischievous robe. Of course, the old loup-garou never caught for his bundle, and the hide became a relic in the neighbouring church, a very much more palpable one than some of the sound of the bells of Solomon's temple, which was preserved in the same place. Of the many put to death on the continent for this offence, and hundreds suffered in a very few years, everyone confessed to a horrid liking for the flesh of children, and whatever we may think about the transformation, there is no denying the cannibalism. Certainly, as was proved by the fate of a squadron of dragoons, every man of which was destroyed by these animals, there was no lack of real wolves to account for the destruction of the children who happened to be devoured, but it was impossible to mistake those cases wherein the little victim had fallen beneath the ferocity of the loup-garou, for in every such instance the clothes were found lying uninjured beside the remains of the horrible feast. The Irish man-wolf, however, if we were to credit Giraldus Cambrensis, was not to be charged with such atrocities, nor was it by choice that he adopted that shape. On the contrary, those who became wolves in the Emerald Isle were the victims of a vindictive churchman. Indeed, it was in form only that these Irish werewolves differed from the most orthodox Christians, just as it is in form only that certain Irish Christians of the present time differ from orthodox wolves. For Giraldus tells us a very moving story of a wolf which stopped a priest on the highway and induced him to administer the sacrament to his mate, who lay dying in a brake hard by. As a wind-up to this wonderful story, Camden avers that it was not uncommon for jilted mistresses and deserted wives to bribe witch and wizard that they might place the faithless men in such a situation as should consign them to the penal servitude of lycanthropy for the usual term of 7 years. Like everything of the sort, the notion was a powerful instrument of evil in the hands of the mischievous. As an instance, a lady was burnt in Auvergne in the year 1558 on this charge. The only witnesses against her were her husband, a friend of his, and her own severed hand. "Mind you, bring me what you take," shouted the husband from a window to his friend, who was going to the chase. Accordingly, after an absence of several hours, the hunter made his appearance with a very light game bag. In explanation, he informed his friend that he had encountered a large wolf, and after a long struggle cut off one of its claws. Thereupon, said he, the wolf scampered off on 3 legs and escaped, and bagging the limb, I made the best of my way back. Looking for the prize, the pair, much to their astonishment as they declared, found a little white hand covered with rings at the bottom of the bag. Recognizing one of the gems, the husband and his friend descended to the kitchen, and there found the lady minus a hand. In a few days more, the poor woman was a heap of ashes. The story needs no comment. A more palpable case of conspiracy was never disclosed. What becomes of the villainous pair, history does not relate, but it is to be feared that they escaped like too many others of the same tribe. At length, what with child murder and priestly anathemas, the werewolves became the objects of intense terror, and the persecution against them, previously disconnected and fitful, assumed towards the end of the 16th century something of the intensity of a crusade. But the first and most prominent effect of this was to make lycanthropy in some sense a reality. Nothing else being talked about, hundreds of weak heads were turned, and silly people by the score not only accused themselves of the crime, but actually attempted to play wolf, though somehow or other they could never manage the transformation to the satisfaction of their neighbours. Several of them, however, got over this difficulty by asserting that they wore their bristles inside their skin. The learned, with their usual discernment, took these people at their word, and thereupon ensued a very animated discussion as to the wherefore and all the particulars of this extraordinary fact. A great many remarkably ingenious theories were propounded about it, which satisfied everybody 100 times over, except those who had counter-theories of their own. At length, a mob of very unlearned Italian villagers cut off the feet of a poor madman who announced himself a werewolf, a deed which thoroughly settled the question, and from that day forth the mania died out.